So before I get started, a quick favor I'm going to ask. Everybody smile and push together. Thought that'd be a nice memory to have, and also I want to be able to prove that at some point during this discussion everyone was awake and happy. Because I have a little bit of bad news to share, unfortunately. The news from the front is not good. We are losing, to a great extent, our quest to maintain a healthy work-life balance. In survey after survey, 90% of us feel like we don't have the healthy work-life balance that we aspire to. So for the other 10% who feel like they have balanced these well, I've got a little bad news for you too, unfortunately. It's really not the right goal, possibly. This idea of holding your work and your life as two separate things that are competing, that we try to balance, that we split our energies to, is probably not the highest aspiration we can have. So what I want to do today is introduce a new model that people are looking at, which is a more integrated work-life experience where your work is not apart from your life, but it is a part of your life. And I think if you adopt this, it can have some profound impact on your lives. So now the good news that I want to spend a lot of time on is that the world is changing. And it's changing in ways that make the workplace much more flexible, so that I think you'll have a much better opportunity to be successful in this new goal that we're going to talk about. So the universe is conspiring in our favor. That's a good thing to have. First, let's check in a little bit on how we're doing. Does this look familiar? It should, because a lot of us feel like this a lot of the time, don't we? We're pulled really hard in different directions by all the responsibilities that we have, so that we're barely hanging on. Now, sometimes you can get the pulse of a society by our casual conversations. And I remember when I was a kid, when my parents would run into somebody they knew, they'd say, "How you doing?" And the person would always answer, "Fine." That was the perfunctory response to the perfunctory question. But now, if you ask somebody that, 9 times out of 10, they're probably not going to say fine. You can try this when you go back to your office, or those who are on your iPhones right now can probably try it in real time. They're probably going to answer, when you say, "How are you doing?" people are going to say, "Busy." That's become the normative pulse of our society, from fine to busy in one lifetime. So how do we hope to maintain a balanced work life in this kind of climate, where busy has become the expected response, where there's global competition, right-sizing, all kinds of changes that make both work and life more hectic? Well, I propose that you don't. I propose that we look at a model that actually brings those things together, because the tension that we have introduced by having a separate work and life actually creates more stress. So I'm going to talk about 3 quick themes, because I've got to go through this very fast. The first is challenging things that appear to be true, but when you investigate them a little further, maybe you're not. That's this flat earth section of the discussion. And then the second is a bit of a sailing lesson, which is talking about not just moving forward, but moving in the direction in which you want to be going. And the third is to explore the good news, how the universe is going to help us to attain this higher goal that I think, which is an integrated work-life experience that will feel less stressful, more productive, and will feel more enriched as human beings. So the first is a bit of a test, and if you'll indulge me, I'd like you to read this sentence really quickly and count the times you see the letter F. F as in freedom. And feel free to do it twice. We at TEDx want everyone to feel successful. So let me see how we did. Most of us will get 3 statistically, and that's what I got. And if you got 4, that's very good. You're 33% more perceptive than I am. But did anybody actually get 5, be honest? A lot of you. Okay, well, you're wrong too. The answer is 6. So what happened? This is an easy thing, and we're really smart people. But the brain skips over things that it deems unimportant, right? These ofs are what the things people usually miss, and there's 3 of them. Well, first of all, it's a V sound in of, which is a little dissonant. It wasn't what you're expecting. But also, the brain just says these small letters are not important. And we do this with lots of things in life. But to the question we were posed with, which is how many Fs appear, it was very material, each of those. So we can't always trust our first impressions, even for things that seem obvious. If I were to ask anybody in the audience to read this, almost everybody would say, "I love Paris in the springtime," because we all do, right? And it's something that we're used to that saying. But most of us would miss the second V. It's a dissonant thing. It's not supposed to be there, right? So things that we do out of habit control how we perceive things. So the last thing, if we were to look at this picture, most of us would say that's a frog, obviously. And if there's any herpetologists in the room or someone who spends all their time thinking about amphibians, like my 7-year-old son Manny, you would say, "You're crazy, that's a toad, that's not a frog." But we would probably have the debate around that. But if you switch the perspective a little bit, you see it's potentially a horse. So what do all these tests mean to us? A couple things. One, we could miss things that really are obvious, but they seem unimportant, and that could change how we perceive the answer to something, and that we're governed by habit. So in the connection with this work-life balance thing, it seems obvious to do. It seems very intuitive to pursue that, but when you dig into it and get under the hood, I feel that maybe it's not really the most logical thing to pursue, but we've done it out of habit. So I want to see if we can change our perspective a little bit, turn it on its side, and see if a new truth doesn't emerge. So most of us have an image like this in mind when we think of a work-life balance. And work-life balance is a cultural project. It's something everybody is trying to pursue, and we tend to think of it this way: work on one side, life on the other side, and we're trying to constantly marshal resources from one to the other to maintain some kind of balance. And we're often moving back and forth because one's suffering and the balance is moving a little bit. And it introduces an extra stress in our life, a lot of guilt, for one. A lot of times we go through life feeling like we're not devoting enough time to our personal interests, to our families, to our health. Or we feel like we're not giving our best to our careers, because when we give one thing to one side, it takes away from the other side. It's the result of a zero-sum game. We're referees in this tug of war. And that's not really the way to go through life. You probably know people like I do who are fully engaged in what they do. You could talk to them when you meet them, and you know what they do for a living, and because you know everything about their life. They live by a model that's a little bit more like this, I think, which just looks and feels way better to me, where they're leading a life, and everything is an integrated part of that, including work. Do you ever hear anybody talk about a friend's life balance or a recreation life balance? No, that's all part of life. Why should work be any different? I'd suggest it better not be, because we spend 10, 12 hours a day there. It's too much time to check out of life. We don't have enough to spare. So you need to think about these things as one part of integrated whole. So it's a better picture, I think you'd agree, but you might be asking yourself, is this just a semantic difference? Is this just a way to talk about it that doesn't mean anything? I don't think it is. I admit it's subtle, and that's why we don't get it right away. But there is a real difference here. It's significant. You've heard maybe the story about the two bricklayers, and one was asked what he's doing, and he says, "Well, I'm stacking one brick on top of the other with some mortar in between." And the other was asked what he's doing, and he said, "I'm building a cathedral that's going to be a source of inspiration for 1,000 years." So how we talk about things matters, as somebody said earlier today. How we think about things makes a real difference. And I think that's true here. If you really embrace the fact that the work that you do is really a reflection of who you are and needs to be an integrated part of your life, not a part where you kind of check out and then come back into your life, at least 3 things will happen immediately, in my opinion. One is, you will be one person all the time. And who doesn't really want that experience? You know those people who are a terror at the office, but they go home on the weekend and they're a sweetheart, and we tend to apologize for those people. We should sympathize with them. It's a terrible, inauthentic way to live. What most of us want is to be our true selves throughout our entire life, and work's a big part of it. So if you really embrace work and life as one thing, you're forced to be who you are all the time, and you're enabled to do that, in fact. Second thing, you will choose better work, I believe, and you'll do your work better. I'm not saying that you should go quit your jobs. There's a lot of books out there that will tell you what color your parachute is and who moved your cheese and things like that. I'm talking about structural things here. And if you remove this tension, you will end up doing a better job, third thing, in everything. Because when you devote time to your career, you won't feel like you're stealing from your life. And that's the tension that we've introduced by this model that ultimately, I believe, is not rational and not really survivable as we get to a more competitive climate. If 90% of us feel like we're not getting there, there's something wrong with the test, I believe. So how do you get there? So I think there's 2 things to be thinking about. One is to aim at the proper target. Thoreau teaches us that man generally hits what he aims at. And if we're aiming at setting up a duality between work and life, that's probably where we're going to go. But if you aim at something higher, which is I'm going to be a fully integrated person with all the things I do to be part of my life, where my work is a part of, not apart from my life, you're more likely to get there. So aim at that target. And secondly, take advantage of the new freedoms that we have. The workplace is changing in lots of ways, many of which allow work to be much more customizable than it ever was in the past. Dan Pink, who spoke at TED before, calls the shift moving from a one-size-fits-all workplace to a my-size-fits-me workplace. So we have a lot of flexibility to take advantage of. I'm going to talk about some of that in the few minutes I have. I'll recommend some books so you can get in deeper. But first I wanted to establish that we are moving into a new epoch in human development. And whenever the economic model changes, society changes with it, and the workplace changes as well. And if you look at this, what we think of as a job, which is you go someplace working for another entity, and you do that for a set period of years, really has only existed for a little while. This isn't really to scale, but you see these other epochs date back 10,000 years, I guess it works out to be. And before this, what you did and where you and who you were was all one thing. When we were hunter-gatherers, we did that all the time. In fact, archaeologists think that we only spent 2.5 hours a day on the basics of getting food and shelter, and the rest of the time was leisure. Once we decided that we could have private property and stay in one place, and animal husbandry, which is not as kinky as it sounds, that just means putting a plow on an ox. We still had a hard life, but it was not because our work was at war with who we were, it was at one with who we were. It wasn't until the industrial age somebody came up with a good way to separate seeds from cotton and textile development, and there was a massive urbanization, massive factory movement, that what we recognize as jobs finally arose. But we're moving out of that model now, right? We're now in an information age, started in the 70s, and there will be new structures. So don't think that just because you knew this world as careers up to now, the workplace will change. Let me talk about some ways. So the ways it's changing is making it much more flexible and customizable. I can hit just a couple of these. It used to be that you had a narrow geographic options. You had to work near where you lived, but because of technology, connectivity, social changes, you can now have remote access. So let's say you want to live in a small town but work in the finance industry. That is now possible in ways it hasn't been before. We used to have the comfort of lifetime employment, but we also had the limitation of lifetime employment. There was a real stigma to leave. So if it wasn't working, you tended to have to stay. You didn't want to be considered a job hopper. You didn't want to have to start over from the bottom. But it's understood that there will be multiple jobs and careers. Graduates coming out of schools today will have, on average, 11.5 jobs throughout their life. They'll have 4 separate careers, typically, meaning, they'll work for a while, they'll go back to school, they'll come back, have another career, maybe move and shift, and then later in life, take on a 4th career. So there's a lot of opportunity to get this right. There's a lot of freedom there. Fixed hours. You used to have to punch in at 8 and punch out at 6. That might seem somewhat comforting to some of us because we work a lot more, but think about the freedom that comes from not having to do that because we have the ability to do things. So if you have a child, a parent needs help, something else going on in your life, we now have the flexibility to work in more open ways. Now, the seniority system. You don't have to wait your turn to add value, to be taken seriously anymore. 20-year-olds are changing the world all over the place. You see this in the paper, too. So let's say you were to switch something. You don't have to start at the bottom and work your way up. If you can add value and impact early on, that is valued and allowed. When I was growing up, if you talk to any of the dads in my neighborhood, they said, well, I work for the phone company, or I work for one of the defense contractors, Pratt & Whitney, United Technologies. People don't think about it this way. Look at your friends on LinkedIn. It's a skills-based identity rather than a companies-based identity. I'm a PHP programmer, I'm a psychologist, I'm a network engineer. So this means that you bring those things where you go. The consummate image of today is not the career ladder, it's the network. So that brings freedom to move around. So how do you manage your career? What are some of the things that work? Well, I think that the things that have worked for breakthrough companies in this economy will work for people in managing their careers as well. Learning from market experience is super important. Companies like PayPal, Instagram, Twitter, many of the companies that we see that have been transformative are not known for the thing they started out doing. They got out, they got some market experience, and they transitioned, sometimes made radical changes. We don't do that with our careers that much. You start out as an accountant, and that's pretty much what you do. And if the market changes, what do? You work harder, typically. But that's not really the answer. And companies will shift to follow markets, and I think we can do that in our careers too. Change, super important, of course. Why do companies like Kodak struggle so much? Because they had so much vested in the old way and they couldn't embrace change. But in careers, we can do that as well, I think. The companies that do change, like IBM, tend to thrive. I talked a little bit about the power of our networks. I'll kind of leave that for now because it's a big topic. And the last thing is to think about this as a process. Your mission in life is to find your mission in life, not to know your mission in life. And I think that's true with your career as well. So you're constantly in investigation. You have the freedom that we can now use. I'll recommend 2 books. They're not mine, so I feel comfortable doing this. Reid Hoffman, who founded LinkedIn, wrote a great book about being the CEO of your career, using the principles that work for companies in your own life. Dan Pink, I mentioned before, chronicling this phenomenon of the free agent nation. There's now, when he wrote this book, 35 million people working for themselves who used to be working for corporations, structuring their career in a way that works for their lives. Last thing, I'll make a point about entrepreneurship. I've been an entrepreneur for many years, and I'm not advocating this for anybody, but I'm just saying that entrepreneurship will be a persistent part of society going forward. I now run a company that is enabling teens to come and start their own company for the first time, and it's amazing to watch what kids are doing there. 40% of people under 24 want to start their own business. That's the largest plurality of anything else. So there's going to be a huge wave of entrepreneurship. You talk to any teen today, none of them will know who runs Exxon or Motorola or Coca-Cola, but they all know who runs the coolest little startup, and that's the mindset. So this entrepreneurialism won't just be a bunch of kids with their shirts untucked starting companies. It will be us in all our companies. We have to be entrepreneurial. My CTO, Sean Kelley, at this company says that our kids won't use the next Facebook, they'll build it. So we are seeing a great wave in entrepreneurship that creates a lot of freedom. But it starts in the way, I think, at managing your career with figuring out what the objective is. Damon said it really colorfully this morning, have prodigious expectations, I think was the term he used. So you need to know what you're aiming towards. And I said Thoreau talks about we only hit what we aim at. So let's aim at something human and integrated that will help you fully actualize yourself. And I believe that that is embracing your work and life as one thing. So Thoreau often gets it right, but I'll also quote in deference to my dad, home plate philosopher Yogi Berra, who said, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. So I encourage you to be conscious about that. Thank you all.